Attendees are in listen-only mode.
We'd like to thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you on this webinar with us, where we're going to discuss how to communicate during 6 stages of a crisis. This very special webinar series features Dr. Robert Chandler, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. We invite you to become our friend at Facebook. Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook account. You can also follow us on Twitter at FirestormSoul. There's a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product presented today must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion.
I'll jump in, Bill, if that's okay.
Well, let me introduce you first. Our president, Jim Satterfield, is on, and he's going to introduce Dr. Chandler. Go ahead, Jim.
Dr. Chandler, I was so excited to talk about you, I just couldn't wait at this point. So it's good to have you on as we were talking. I've known Dr. Chandler for a number of years and spoken at conferences with him and seen him speak as the keynote speaker at groups and associations around the U.S. and I know internationally, and as he moves forward. As we think on and we'll share a little bit about the 5 common failures in businesses in those directions, but communications plays such a critical role. And when I think about crisis communications and what role that needs to be played, Dr. Chandler exemplifies that information at every step along the way. And so I think you're in for a treat. This is the start of a 6-part webinar series, and we're having to coordinate schedules and times, but I'm glad to get it kicked off today, and we will, as we do with other sessions, have this available on demand if you want to share that later within your organization. Obviously, with hundreds of people on today's call, we won't be able to do an open mic question area, but if there are questions, you can use the toolbar to your right to jot those down, and we're going to make every effort to follow up to everyone who's on the webinar today and talk about doing these things together, or even maybe doing a workshop in your area. As we think about this, we find in a crisis people focus on actions and words, and always there's a concern about what do I do and what do I say. And one of the big failures is that people don't understand why they're saying the words or taking the actions that they do, and we see that repeated over and over. Also in a crisis, time and access. Getting the information to the right people at the right time becomes extremely important, and access to those tools become extremely important. And we're going to delve into that today, and I've asked Dr. Chandler if he will give us that overview and then specifically talk about the first stage as we focus on. I wanted to remind you that as we have talked in earlier webinars and continue with the webinar series that we do, we've seen 5 common failures that occur repeatedly in disasters and crises. And the failure to control critical supply chains, the failure to train employees for both work and at home, the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. And by the way, the webinar series next month that Karen Mazzullo, our EVP for Business Intelligence, is going to do is really going to zero in on that monitor aspect. And the 4th is failure to conduct exercises and update your plans. And today we really are emphasizing this develop a crisis communications plan. And I think the framework that you're about to hear will put that in perspective for you very, very well. So here's the agenda that Dr. Chandler has put in place for us today, and you're going to learn some new words with radar and sonar there. Dr. Chandler, what would you like to say about the agenda that you've laid out?
Well, we're going to keep this very simple and straightforward. I value people's time, and thank you for giving me a chance to share some of my work And we're going to just introduce the idea of why look at 6 stages for communication planning purposes. I think it's very helpful and very practical, and I hope that it's helping each of you think about how you're going to be prepared for the communication needs and demands. Talk a little bit about the first stage. Since this is the first of 6 webinars, we have 6 stages. Okay, I think that makes sense. We'll talk a little bit about the warning phase and the connection of the warning phase. The third is, I think we're going to do a little bit about monitoring threats and getting those types of steps involved with understanding what to do and how to do that at given stages. I'm going to talk specifically about 2 techniques that I teach in the workshops and consulting that I do. I try to do little acronyms. I know I'm cutesy. My kids get embarrassed with me, but I talk about radar and sonar just as little ways to remember those. So we're going to go through those and talk about those today.
And I think everybody's in for a treat. If you've not had a chance to see Bob's vision of crisis communication, this is an excellent framework. And Bob, I don't think this is a good picture of you. I think you've changed a little bit since you have had this picture taken.
I think my hair grayed a little bit.
I think so. And so the idea here is this a one-size-fits-all approach to crisis communications? And I believe that today in our conversation you're going to see that that's in fact not the case. Now, if I remember correctly, we did some survey questions, and I want to share that with the group today because I think these are very powerful. You were asked, does your company have a crisis communications plan? Great news is 74% of you said, yep, we've got it. 15% nope, we don't have one, and 11% said we don't know. And always, if you don't know, that means you don't have it. You don't know where it's going to fit in. And I think those numbers are consistent with the results that we've seen in a lot of surveys that have done. And Dr. Chandler, you had shared with me on an earlier session you had done, and I think the percentages were almost spot on with this. But the next one is a little bit alarming, and I want to share that with the group today based on all your answers. Is the plan specifically adapted to changing situations? You'll notice that only 40% said yes, 22% said no, and again, that magic don't know, 38%. So over half, there's a fairly high level of uncertainty. And I think the framework that Dr. Chandler has put together with the 6 stages will help you understand that you have to do the monitoring. You have to adapt what you're going to say at each step along the way to see what's there. So, Dr. Chandler, we look at 5 stages of escalation when we look at crises and how plans come together. Dr. Chandler is going to bring us in at that warning stage before actually the onset and then view it over 6 stages. And so I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Chandler. Why don't you talk about the crisis?
Well, thanks, Jim. What I have found over the years in working with different companies in the public and private sector of all different sizes, that many people, when they say, yes, we have a crisis communication plan, often when I probe that, it turns out that it's not a very adaptable or flexible plan. In fact, sometimes it's either, yes, we can deal with media relations, we have a public information spokesperson, typically only one, and anyway, there's problems even with those, or we have an incident notification plan, and those are important pieces of the puzzle. Please don't get me wrong. When I talk about communication planning, though, I try to push people to think about all of the aspects of communication. When we do after-action reviews, and this will not surprise any of you who have any experience, one of the single most frequent and most significant problems identified in how different events were handled are communication problems. And they're not just public statements to the media, although those are big screw-ups in and of themselves, but there are failures to inform people, there's failures to connect people, to include critical information. No one told us, or we were told something different. And so I want you just to stop for a minute and think about all of the different types of communication that go on among your team, among your people, communicating with stakeholders, communicating with senior management, all of the responsibilities that you have, as well as neighbors and community and everyone else. And once you understand the complexity of communication and the scope of it, let me make it even more complicated. Let me suggest to you that a crisis is not a singular event. A disaster is not a singular event. Yeah, it's one thing, but actually there are different periods of it where, as we plan to communicate, think about all the changes that swap out. People we need to notify, people we need to alert, who we're talking to, how we're going to talk to them, what options are off the table, on the table. All of these things are sort of a giant moving matrix. So in a sense, you have to think about the entire life cycle of a crisis. And so I have a very simple little model. I don't claim it's, it's not the only model. Jim mentioned 5 stages of escalation, and this is really not trying to duplicate that or overtake it. This is really that I use this when I work with groups about designing their own communication plans more as a think piece. I want you to think about your status in each of these stages. And so I want to ask simple questions today. What is the life cycle? The predictable life cycle. Not every crisis is the same. Not all of them will evolve the same way. They certainly won't have the same duration in each stage. I recognize all that. But what is the life cycle? And what's the purpose of looking at the life cycle for communication planning? And how can we make this practical? I don't want to do this just at a theoretical level. And so quite simply, when we look at this particular model, Jim, go to the next slide. I'm just going to give them the bullet point list. So we're looking really at distinctive stages, and I have arbitrarily chosen not only 6 of them, but the titles for them. And so we can argue about, well, Bob, there's a better name for that one, and that's okay. I'm not going to really argue the point very long. I call the first one the warning stage. The second is risk assessment stage. The third is response. Fourth is the ongoing management stage. Fifth is the resolution. Thank goodness they get resolved. And then 6, of course, is the recovery period, that even when it's over, it's not over. So much more communication has to go on in that final stage. So if we begin to think about the fact of a life cycle of a crisis that has these different stages during them, here we go. This is not rocket science. We're going to think about, in terms of our communication planning, how it would adapt. So look at my illustration here. Just look at this little illustration. A couple of things you should notice right off the bat. There is some communication that's going on, obviously, before the incident occurs. And some of that is long-term planning and education. There's some important crisis communication that has to happen before there's ever even a hint of crisis. But some of it is in this period I call the warning period. And that's both when you get a warning and when you should be looking for warning signs. Then an incident happens. Then a whole series of other stages begin to take place. Now, I've used colors and shapes and sizes. My inner 4-year-old art talents here showing. But notice some things. First of all, these are not distinctive phases. My point is not that these are separate and isolated. My point is they are overlapping and interconnected. That's a very important takeaway. Secondly, not only does the target audience, the messages, the purposes, the reasons, the tools, the techniques vary for each stage, so too does the urgency, the stress, the external factors, the environmental factors, the psychological factors, the technological factors, and I'll tell you key points when those tend to break down. So as we begin to think about communication planning, I want you to think about this as a life cycle, and that miniature other types of crisis evolve in the middle of them, and it may not be one crisis. In fact, there could be overlapping life cycles of various crises, that you start out with something that's an earthquake that quickly becomes a tsunami, that becomes a flood, that becomes a atomic power plant radioactive containment issue, that becomes a supply chains issue, that becomes a radioactive radiological event issue, which becomes a stock market issue, which becomes a supply chain issue. I mean, it's not ever one singular event ever. I mean, even one event is not one singular event. It's a multiple series of things, and I think that's what you have to think about it. So that is a very, very abbreviated, normally I give a full lecture on understanding the life cycle, but I've really compressed it for you. And to think about the idea of how are we going to communicate, not during an event, but during a life cycle event, and that's really where we're at. So today's webinar, we're going to shift over and focus on that stage 1, and which I've labeled warning. Now, so first of all, not every event or cycle has warning signs. Let's just say that right off the bat. Sometimes the first time you know something's happening, quite literally, no matter how vigilant and diligent you've been, is boom, something happens. I get that, and in fact, there may be very little other than monitoring of warning communication. And we'll talk about the need for passive and assertive monitoring in just a little bit later today. Some events have no warning periods, or you've not noticed them. The water main breaks, the gas line explodes. Now, should you have been doing things to pay attention to know there was a risk of the gas line, or should you have been monitoring social media to know that you have a disgruntled employee who's threatening to come in and shoot things up? Yeah, you should be, and you should be finding warnings, but sometimes you got no warning. Other ones, you clearly have warnings. I'm here in Florida right now talking to you, and we may have weather warnings, whether for tornadoes or hurricanes, and that we get prepared for or know they're coming. Winter storm warnings, not here in Florida, but elsewhere. I have taught at a university for most of my careers, and always during final exam weeks, we get those calls coming in and threatening that you should cancel final exams. I mean, you have various times where either you see a very visible warning, weather, or you have an engineer tells you that your balconies are not sufficiently structured, and we've issued you a report, and they're prematurely rotting and aging, and they can't bear the weight of what you think they should. That's a warning. What are you going to do about it? You could ignore it, say, well, no balcony has collapsed yet. Not very prudent. Or you could have somebody call in your office and say, I'm going to blow up your building today. What do you do at that moment when you get a warning? And that's part of what this warning phase is. Who do you communicate with? Do you have a plan? Do you have a target audience? Who gets notified? What do you say? What's the difference between scaring people and activating a plan? How many people need to know this? What is your own warning in terms of how seriously you're taking this? What's your internal communication? Do you immediately notify outside audiences? I would think law enforcement, and I would think your own types of security apparatus, your own crisis management people that you've got on retainer. I mean, there's a series of things. What are your messages? How are you assessing it? What information did you gather? Who's listening? Who's still listening? Who's working hard to use surveillance? And that's where the new stuff on social media and online resources become very good. Normally, yes, go ahead, Jim.
One of the things that I see on the screen that's up, and I'd like, if you don't mind, saying a word or two about it, is the why. One of the things that when we walk into a crisis, and unfortunately Firestorm gets to do that almost daily now, and we're seeing lots of camps in crisis this summer already, is to focus on the why communicate. And I would challenge everybody that's listening to you today is that they would focus on why are they going to communicate. Bob's given you great examples. He took the events in Japan or the collapsing balconies in San Francisco and brought those out to set that up. But think about your communications at every step around the word, why are you communicating? Then therefore you can see the effectiveness of the communications if you understand the why.
No, now, that's a very brilliant point, Jim. In fact, when I do this workshop, I often work with a group who are thinking about communication. So I love going up to the whiteboard and I let people, this is how it typically goes. They say, oh, well, we have to notify so-and-so, Bob. We're required to do that. So I write those names down. The word why is my most frequently used word for that entire brainstorming session that I run with people, which is, even if, well, we have to tell them there's a bomb. And so my first question is, why? Who do you have to tell? Why them? Why do you have to tell them that? How much do you tell them? Why? What do you not tell them? Why? How are you telling them this? Why? I think that's just a very insightful comment. I think why is one of the most common things I love doing. And what I find is that so many people don't think about the why. They say, well, we just have to do that. And of course, my question, why? Why do you have to do that? Or no, we don't want to do that. Why? Why do you not want to have it? And here's the thing. I think that the why question is either going to get answered in advance of an event, which gives you time to vet it, get everybody sign off on it, to think about it in a calm and rational manner. Or the why question is going to be answered in the heat of the moment where you're going to spend little time thinking about it, not having all of your resources and calm, cool-headedness to make the decision. And if it doesn't happen there, it's going to happen in the aftermath as the reporters line up and look at you and say, why? Why did you do or not do that? Why did you notify or not notify? Why did you share that information? So if you ask me which of those 3 points do you want to have to really work to come up with the why, my personal suggestion is let's do it now. Let's spend some time so that we have the why answer to our satisfaction, so that when it's come time to either do it or justify why we do it, that we have a very substantive rationale and a justifiable basis. Sorry, I'll quit preaching.
You did great. No, you can't emphasize this enough, Bob. One of the things that we do is we remind people, if you've been around a 5-year-old and you tell them don't put their hand on the stove, and they go, why? And then you give the answer that the stove is on. Why? Because we're going to cook dinner. Why? It's time to eat. And as a general rule, answering that question 5 times gives you a great deal of certainty in your communications. But it looks like on the slide that's up, there are lots of different types of communications, in, out. Talk a little bit about that.
I think when I work with groups, one of the first things people say, oh, Bob, we know we have to send messages out. And you do. And that's certainly a large part of it. I would never diminish the significance of that. What people often don't spend as much time for preparing for their crisis communication is how they're going to get inbound. How about just a simple word like listening? What are you listening to? To whom? How are you listening? What type of listening are you doing? Are you just nodding your head listening and letting stuff stack up on a inbound information tray, or are you actually using it in a system? The third level, so it's outbound, it's inbound, but I also want to do this two-way piece, because what I have found through my experience of working with so many people at crisis communication planning is that one of the most important things is two-way communication. Sustaining interactive communication. There's so many places that misunderstandings happen. Word choices, framing. I wrote a blog essay a couple of weeks back about 2 little words in the General Motor cobot ignition switch issue, and I'm not the first to notice it. I actually quoted other people who noticed it, but to me it was so profound that the defect on the ignition switch was labeled a consumer convenience issue, not a safety defect, and that there is substantial evidence that indicates that it was never given the priority when there were literally hundreds of other expensive recalls from far less serious issues that went on at the same time period, and it looks in retrospect that it simply was using the wrong label for the problem in the meeting agendas. You say, Bob, how could that really affect it? Surely we would see through that, but no, sometimes the little spin, the framing. We even know that how you communicate. In fact, I don't have time to go. This is a separate webinar, Jim, we should come back and do. But whether you're on the phone, on a radio, on an email, face-to-face, on a video conference, we have evidence that indicates it not only changes how you communicate, it changes the decisions you reach and the urgency you reach decisions. And that is something, once again, let me give my sermon, I want people to think about prior to an incident, not during an incident, and not after an incident when people are saying, why in the world did you or didn't you do this or that? I think crisis communication, of course I'm biased, let me just admit that. I think crisis communication planning is one of the most critical things you can do, because communication, whatever other plans you have, if you can't ensure that connection, then you're in trouble. So really, it's really a question for the warning phase, asking about your readiness. And have you thought through all of these questions, the who, what, why, when, where, how? Have you thought through the different processes involved to look at both inbound, outbound, and two-way communication? Have you looked at how language works and how well prepared people are to communicate? Can you assign those communication strategies? Are you able to implement them? Can you trigger them? A lot of people who follow my work know that I'm a big fan of mapping out your priority messages and priority audiences. I call them message maps. Those are checklists. Pilots use checklists. They don't fly a plane because they know everything in their head. When something goes wrong in flight, a pilot flips open the checklist in the manual. I think you should have similar checklists. I think you need to assign people and resources and responsibilities and hold them accountable. I think you have to have the protocols and procedures for, and we're talking about stage 1 today. I'm going to say this in all the stages, but you've got to have a roadmap. And you've got to have people able to follow that and know why. I think you have to have your audiences prepared in advance. The first time you should communicate with me should not be when there's a problem. You have to have an ongoing communication relationship. And you have to use that at the appropriate stage with the appropriate audience. And then you have to actually do it. I am still stunned at how many after-action reviews simply end with the phrase, "Oh, and we failed to communicate." It's one thing to do it wrong and shoot yourself in the foot, and that's bad. But the very fact you say, we just failed to tell them. We never let that division know. We never told them about the power supply disruption. We never told them that we weren't going to reopen the shop that time. We never told them about the security badging requirements. I have so many examples from after-action reviews, and just a simple failure to communicate with audiences. And so I guess the question, Jim, is, and this is one of the things I like to do when I work with people going through the 6 stages as they look at their own preparedness, is simply really challenge people to say, if you have a situation where there's a warning, and that we're just in the warning phase now, and so whether that's a winter storm coming, or, hey, there's a bomb in your building, or, hey, this disgruntled employee just called in and made a threat against everybody at the company, what protocols do you have? Who are you communicating to? What, when, where? What steps are you taking? Does everybody have the correct information? And can you defend that you have vetted and thought through that that's the right thing to do? And if you say, well, Bob, I'll need legal to vet it. I need our public information to vet it. We need our senior management to vet it. Okay. Do it in advance, not during the event. If those are the kinds of things that are running through your mind right now, this is not something you procrastinate. Does that make sense, Jim, with where we're going?
It does, and I think it goes. If we opened, if you remember, with some basic questions, and at the bottom it said time and access. In this position, before these events, in the pre-action area, we have the luxury of time. Once the event has started, we don't have that luxury of time, and so having the message maps in advance, having the channels, a company who has decided that they're going to communicate with their employees on Facebook in the middle of a crisis shouldn't be launching the Facebook site in the middle of the crisis. They have to be trained in advance. And the point that you put on the slide where it says, are you ready to deploy, assign, implement, reach, and communicate, I think that designs a good answer for us as we start to structure that. And as you continue on, I think this is really starting to drill into the elements that you've laid out, Bob. With, by the way, I changed your who to whom on that slide, and if that's wrong, then my 12th grade English teacher, Mrs. Taylor, would probably be very angry at me with that change if I missed it. But think about those elements that you have listed here. What clarification would you like to add on this slide, Bob?
Well, I want to stop and talk about a little bit of what we call audience analysis. One of the things I do with folks as we design messages is that we think about what we're going to be saying and the context in which we're saying it. We actually spend some time thinking about real people. So if you're going to alert all of your floor wardens to a bomb threat, or all of your administrative assistants or secretarial pool, let's think about for a minute. So how are you going to tell them? How are you going to prepare them in advance? What happens to key people when you say there's a bomb threat? I mean, fear, anxiety. Do they understand? Are they comfortable enough with procedures? I had worked for a university that basically sent out one time in about a 6-year period a simple list of how to write down information during a bomb threat call you might receive. And it was woefully inadequate. It didn't even come close to really understanding that people of different education levels, people of different jobs, how they might handle it. Think about the who. Think about your own team and how they'll be in position. And they'll probably be some of the seasoned veterans, and you can use some very clear and abrupt and frank language that you will never want to use in sending an email or a alert message out to your janitorial staff and searching for an explosive IED or something. Think about your key constituents. Think about the who. You know, a citizen, a neighbor, an investor, a family member. Everybody's going to react differently, and so as you design communication, again, one size fits all is not the approach here. I really want us to think about it, and I also want to think about how even the typical audiences you're talking to during an event, they change themselves. We'll talk about adrenaline and some of the psychological noise, fear, anxiety, uncertainty. There's so many variables. Advanced planning is essential. It is.
Bob, but I think what you're saying rings really true, and I've never heard anybody express it quite the way that you just did, which I think is excellent. I would encourage everyone that's listening to put a face on who's getting the message.
Yeah.
If it's a student and you're in a school and we're talking to people in schools, think about a face of a particular student, how they would react to that. If you're in a company, think about people in the various departments or customers or critical vendors, because we're all used to getting those verbal and nonverbal cues back from who we talk to. And when you're sending the message out with this warning, the statistics vary on the number of people that freeze in a crisis, and the number of people that will actually follow, and the number of people that will lead, and the number of people that lead is extremely small. So I think this key constituents is a missed component in crisis communications regularly, but work with a face, because if you can put a face on this, I think it's going to increase the effectiveness of your crisis communications.
No, we write messages far too many times so they make sense to us and they satisfy us and they fit our own emotional and psychological profile. And frankly, we're writing to the wrong audience. These messages don't have to make sense to us. Oh, well, that doesn't scare me. I talk about death and bombs all the time, Bob. I deal with it. You understand the people you're sending the warning to don't. Good gracious. And so we have to make a paradigm shift in how we communicate in a crisis to really stop. I know this is going to be misquoted, but stop making sense to ourselves and write and talk and speak and communicate in ways that make sense to the people we need it to make sense to, that adapts to their level of anxiety and fear, that adapts to their reading levels, their comprehension levels, their previous experience, their post-traumatic stress. I mean, let's think more sensitively about it. You say, oh, well, Bob, it's very complicated. I have to write an individual message for every individual. Well, okay. That's you got me there. That's reductio absurdum. If in a perfect world, that's exactly what we do. So what we're going to have to do is find the sweet spot of where we can adapt messages for target groups as best as we can, and understand that we may get lucky and get 85% of people not to freak out with our message in our target group. But yeah, will there be somebody else who is in tears and sobbing and emotionally distraught? Of course. Will there be others who say, oh, this wasn't very, I didn't take it very serious. I didn't even go to the fire drill last month. Yes.
So the key factors, as summarized on the slide, are
I think that's my big exhortation, is to really think about that.
Yeah, is the audience, the message, the methods, and the processes. And the methods also could include the medium that we're communicating over. And that makes a big difference. And we know there are mass notification systems, and there are multiple things as we go. And if we look at it's got to fit into an X number of characters, that's another limitation associated with it and how it would come together.
Absolutely.
So the what to communicate, and we're in a warning phase, everybody. That's what we're talking about here is warning. And if you look at, I think that Bob has done a great job of bringing it together to look at the information content, what's the threat or the danger, the meta message, the tone, the urgency. Evacuating 10 minutes after the bomb exploded is not going to be nearly as effective as evacuating before the bomb explodes. Specific behavior or action request, the method to confirm compliance, the feedback, and the two-way that he'd had on the interactive. Bob, any of these you want to stress?
Well, I don't want to overdo it. I know that we're limited time, and normally we spend a full day working with people and really doing it. If we were there face-to-face, I think we would spend much more time to really do it. I actually think that we can say the things we need to say in the right order, and we can if we do message maps in advance, we can target different audiences that get slightly different worded versions of these. I think it's marvelous, and I think the new tools are great. I have been around and had my hands on all these different incident notification tools and dashboards and monitoring systems. They're all wonderful tools. None of them communicate. They're simply tools. So communication's still going to come back to people saying words, writing words, speaking words, and how those words are read, attended to, perceived, translated, understood, misunderstood, and then how individuals are going to, through their own psychological processes, react. That's where I want to get our attention, get away from our tools and get more towards thinking about true communication.
And you've used radar as a way to start to
Yes.
focus on that. Help me understand radar, Bob.
Well, okay, so I'm being cutesy, and my apologies to people who get annoyed with that. I'm an old dad, and I love doing this. Radar is for the above surface, above ground, visible warnings that you need to pay attention to. They are the signs of an employee who's become increasingly disgruntled in the workplace. They are things like weather warnings that are announced and distributed. They are things like the phone call that makes a threat, or a report from an engineer that your balconies are not sufficient load bearing and you've got a fundamental flaw that's very expensive to fix. So radar is the above the ground stuff, and I just basically use the acronym to say we need to recognize these things for what they are. We need to anticipate what kind of problems they can be. We need to detect when these things are what I call it threshold points, so they're actionable points, and if possible avoid them. Let's fix them. Let's just not have the crisis, but if not, be prepared for what we're going to respond to do it. And so radar is the more traditional. I've used this model much longer in my training and my work, and normally I would go through with a group and we would discuss it. So how do you recognize it? You know, it's different workplaces need different things. Different companies have different things. Sometimes it's workplace violence issues. Sometimes it's financial issues. Sometimes it's you know, actual handling chemicals in your plant, and I mean, it varies. I can't. One of the things that's very important with all of this is that crisis communication planning should be tailored to your situation and your needs. Anybody who sells you generic, off-the-shelf stuff without ever thinking about your situation, your context, your audience, your risk, is really selling it short. So radar is an approach that makes us vigilant and that we take action to mitigate or avoid, and if we can't do that, to respond appropriately to these things. We look for the warning signs.
And I would encourage everyone to sit down and have a conversation with your team using the radar concept, the model here, as a way to start that discussion. Now, we're getting this inbound information coming, and surveillance and scanning. You talked about social media. And now you're beginning to introduce this sonar, looking below the surface. And
yeah,
let's take that same approach that you did on radar and talk about sonar.
Exactly.
Help me understand.
So radar is the one I've used for years, and you know, I'm old, so I was doing it long before there was social media. Sonar is sort of a new variation that I now speak about, given everything that's out there. You know, I can't tell you how sickening it is after an incident of school violence to have somebody dig up, oh, well, this person was on social media threatening to kill everybody in the school for at least 2 weeks before they did it. That's pointless in this day and age to not look below. You say, well, Bob, how would I know what somebody's posting? The truth is that we can now scan online and new media to anticipate these risks. Okay, it's dorky. You know, I'll take all the cheap shots you want, but sonar, just remember, we're looking below the surface. We're looking below the water line. You know, the most dangerous part of an iceberg is not the piece of the ice you see above water. The most dangerous part of the iceberg is what you don't see and how far it extends, and you think you're steering around it and you don't. Sonar is just a little technique that I use. By the way, there's lots of tools. I don't have time to do it. You know, Firestorm itself has a wonderful approach to help people begin to look at what are my employees saying, who's posting what, are there threats being made, is there some sort of analysis. That's a whole, you know, Sonar is a whole separate webinar, Jim, and it's also a whole separate training thing that could be done for people who really want to think about this very proactively. There are some wonderful tools out there that can be used to help people with scanning both the online and the new media for anticipating these sorts of risks and finding out the warnings before they become an incident.
For everybody that's on the call today, the webinar today, there is a webinar next month. Actually, there's a series of them that Karen Mazzullo will be doing. You can find the link on our website talking about specifically the intelligence network and the concepts that are here, and I think you'll find it very consistent with it. Now, when you talk about sharing a warning, you give us some things that we should at least look at what we're trying to accomplish. Do you want to clarify this any?
Yeah, let me just do it very quickly. I know we're going to be short of time, and I want to get some questions. Basically, people say, well, Bob, how do we write these warnings, and what are some general best practices and things? And so that's all I try to do here. Your goal in a warning is to build or sustain your own credibility and trust. You want to educate and inform people without frightening them. I have a whole separate lecture I give on panic. Panic's not a very serious risk, but you can frighten people, create anxiety, uncertainty. You can distract them. You want to focus on telling them what to do. I'm very much behavioral focused in terms of a best practice for warning messages. Put a snow shovel in your car, put a winter storm kit, put an earthquake kit and everything. I mean, very specific things. And then, of course, you want to look at your own messages. I'm always going to be an empirical social science researcher. I think you should test and validate messages as well as your tools, your channels, your modalities, your procedures. And I never do these things without saying, please map out your messages for each target audience. Know what, when, where, and why you're trying to communicate, and always remember the listening part of it. There, I did it real succinct.
You did it. You did it perfectly well, and I appreciate it.
Uncharacteristically succinct.
Well, listen, I think we're a heck of a team here. I would encourage everyone to use the question function to the right on the toolbar. If you'll jot those questions down, we'll incorporate them in future webinars or get back to you directly as we're going on it. But this is a major commitment to share information with you around crisis communications. We've given an overview of the first stage today. We now will, in subsequent, go through the other 5 stages, adding up to the total of 6 to get you through the process. Firestorm follows a predict, plan, perform process. Predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are. What are their impacts? What are you going to monitor? What are the triggers? What are you going to communicate, as we've talked about heavily today? And you repeat that step at each one of the stages as the crisis escalates and as you move through those elements. The plans, and today we really are emphasizing the crisis communications planning requirements. And then the perform, the testing of your messages, the testing of the channels, the responses that you get, the supplies that you would need, and the continual monitoring. One of the big failures that we see across all of the plans is that people aren't monitoring the results as they come through. So do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? And I think the answer that we always say is yes. If today is tomorrow. The warning signs, the information that's out on social media, the behavior that you're observing, all of those elements are indications of what will be happening tomorrow. So that for all of us, all the business continuity professionals or administrators that are on the call today and the leaderships within the organizations are focused on knowing what's going to happen tomorrow so that we can take the appropriate actions today. You can't afford not to. If you'd like to learn more about that, we're going to do a virtual exercise in August across the country, one geared toward schools and one geared toward business. If you'd like to put your management team around a conference table at your location, and as we go through, you can participate, and a major portion of that exercise will include the communications element. If you would like some help aligning your plans to best practices or creating your own intelligence network, or if you want to schedule training and have someone like Dr. Chandler work with your organization, that's available. Let us know, and we'd be glad to share it. As a next step, you can download the brief from today. You'll have a lot of documentation associated with this. This will be up and available shortly on our website. We'll send a note out to everyone who joined today so that you can immediately do that. And what I'd like to do is to thank, first of all, Dr. Chandler for sharing the insights today. And if you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com and fill out a contact us, and we'll be back. Or you can drop us a webinar, an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or give us a call at 800-321-2219. So, Bob, as we wrap up, we've got about a minute left. Is there a specific piece of advice you want to share with the audience today?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the idea of about today and tomorrow. I would just say that this is, this is your only chance to time travel. So when something's happening and you wish you could go back in time and get better prepared for it, this is your opportunity right now to time travel back to today. And so when that day comes, you can say, "Gosh, I'm glad I went back and I took preparation." Yes, and I would be delighted. And folks, I'm working with Jim here, and just if you have something that you'd like to work on very specific, please let Firestorm know, and they can get in touch with me, and we can figure out how we can be of help.
We appreciate that, and Dr. Chandler, every time we're together, I feel like I learn more, so I appreciate that. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. I encourage you to catch the rest of this 6-part series, as well as Karen Mazzullo and the Intelligence Network next month as we continue to do that. We'll hopefully be in your area soon. I know that there's a big conference coming up in San Antonio in 2 weeks. If you're a RenWeb school, that will be there, and some crisis coach workshops, and one of those is happening on that Monday, I believe it is the 12th in San Antonio, so there's another opportunity. So lots of chance. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you again, Dr. Chandler. I'll be speaking with you a little bit later. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.